In a small town at the end of a harsh winter, an 18-year-old black boy, an orphan, rides his late mother's old bicycle. Struggling to survive through delivery work and doing whatever it takes just to have a place to sleep every night. While rushing to complete his final delivery of the day, he stumbled upon an elderly woman alone and lost at a bus stop. Helping her means missing the delivery and possibly losing his only shelter. But he doesn't hesitate. He pedaled her all the way home. What he doesn't know is she's a billionaire, and what happens next will change his life forever. The wind had begun to turn colder that evening, the kind that nipped at your ears and slid quietly down the back of your neck, even if your coat was buttoned up tight. Along the edge of a quiet town in early winter, where the sun dipped early behind thinning trees, and the street lights flickered with a sluggish pulse, the old bus stop sat abandoned at the far end of a cracked sidewalk. People passed it like they always did, some with grocery bags tugging at their wrists, some with eyes locked to phones, some simply hurrying home before the dark settled in fully. But none of them looked at her. The old woman stood alone, wrapped in a beige woolen coat that had seen better decades, her silver hair poking out from a once white walnut, her small hands clutching a tattered leather purse as she turned to look at every car that passed, hoping it might be the one she was waiting for. Her mouth moved, murmuring something about the number 12 route, about a street that didn't quite match anything around here. And every few moments she took a step toward the curb, only to shuffle back as confusion clouded her face. Not far from her, a young man named Andre had stopped to drink from a dented metal water bottle. He was barely 18, with a frame stretched thin by time and hunger, wearing a hooded jacket faded from too many winters, and a pair of shoes that held together more out of habit than craftsmanship. His old bicycle leaned against the bench behind him. Rusted chains, squeaky pedals, and a rickety back rack that looked like it could fall off if nudged too hard. It had belonged to his mother, and after she passed, it became his only means of working, zipping around the town, delivering small parcels, groceries, medicine, anything people needed. The pay was barely enough to scrape by, but Andre worked with quiet urgency. That evening, he had one last delivery to make before the clock struck 8. One last errand, and if he completed it, he would have just enough to pay his week's rent. If not, the landlord had made it clear the key would no longer fit the lock come morning. Andrew tightened the strap of the delivery bag across his chest, ready to ride out, when his eyes caught the motion of the old woman near the stop. Something about her stillness struck him, not like someone waiting, but like someone lost. She turned again, looked around, then looked at her own feet, as if even they had become unfamiliar. She muttered something, took a half step forward, then stopped. Andre hesitated, the weight of the clock ticking louder in his chest. Minutes mattered now, and the difference between staying warm and being on the street was a single delivery away. But then the wind shifted, and carried her voice over to him, faint, shaky, but unmistakably frightened. Willow Lane, or maybe it was Garden, was it bus 12? Her words tumbled like loose leaves, and nobody else seemed to hear. Without quite realizing why, Andre walked over, pushing his bike beside him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right?" She blinked at him, unsure, the way someone might look at a distant memory. "I was trying to get home," she said, her voice light and wandering. "But I think I missed the bus. Or maybe it missed me." Her laugh was small and brittle, like glass threatening to crack. Andre nodded slowly. "Where do you live? Maybe I can help you get there." She looked down at her purse, then rummaged through it without purpose. A handkerchief came out. A lipstick with no cap. Coins. Buttons, a bus transfer from 2 days ago, but no address. Andre's heart tightened a little. Then something caught his eye. A delicate silver chain around her neck, and at the end of it, a small oval pendant resting against her coat. He leaned closer, squinting. There, engraved in elegant cursive on the back of the charm, were the words: Evelyn Rose, 48 Oak Hill Drive, North Side. His breath caught. Oak Hill. He knew the area. Way out past the edge of town, nearly 2 hours away by bike and most of it uphill. For a moment, Andrei's mind went to the clock again. He would miss the delivery. He would lose his room. He would sleep in the cold tonight. But as he looked into Evelyn's eyes, soft and clouded with age, and saw the childlike trust beginning to form simply because he had stopped to ask, he knew he couldn't walk away. Some choices weigh more than others, even if they don't make sense on paper. Forced a smile. "That's a bit far, but I think we can make it," he said gently, helping her to the back rack of his bike. He tied his spare scarf around the seat and wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. "Hold on tight." "All right, we'll go slow." She chuckled, dazed but grateful, and said, "You remind me of someone. My grandson, he used to wear shoes like those. Always scuffed, always proud." Andrei didn't correct her. He just nodded and began to pedal slowly at first, then more steadily as they left the town lights behind. The sky turned lavender, then gray, and then darker still. The road sloped, bent, and stretched endlessly, but Andrei kept going, every turn of the pedal echoing with a sense of purpose. Behind him, Evelyn hummed a tune, sometimes trailing off, sometimes pausing to ask where they were, then forgetting the answer minutes later. He answered every time as if it were new. "We're getting closer. Don't worry, just over the next hill." The wind grew sharper and the street lamps rarer, but he kept his eyes forward. They passed fields sleeping under frost, crossed bridges lit only by moonlight, and paused once for Evelyn to catch her breath. He bought her a warm cup of tea from a roadside gas station with the last dollar in his pocket, and she insisted he take the first sip. "You need it more," she said with a tender sternness that reminded him of his mother. When the gate of 48 Oak Hill finally appeared, whitewashed with chipped paint and ivy curling around the iron bars, it was nearly 9:30 p.m. Andrei's legs ached, his hands were numb, but he exhaled in relief. He knocked once, then again, and moments later, an elderly man in a house coat opened the door, his expression transforming from panic to disbelief when he saw the woman behind Andrei. "Miss Eland." "Oh my lord, where have you been?" "We've been calling hospitals." Evelyn looked around, then blinked again. "I went for a walk or a ride, I suppose." She smiled at Andrei. The man thanked him profusely, his voice trembling. "Please come inside, warm yourself, have something to eat. Let us give you a ride back." But Andrei shook his head, weary but content. "No need. I should get back before it gets colder." He scribbled his number on a torn receipt and handed it over in case you ever needs help again. And with that, he got back on his bike and rode off into the dark, unaware that his room would be locked and his bed replaced with a storage closet floor, but also unaware that something far more meaningful had just begun. By the time Andrei reached the edge of town again, the street lights had thinned out, and the warmth from the gas station tea had long faded from his hands. His knuckles were stiff, and every bump in the road rattled up through the handlebars and into his bones, but he didn't complain. The ride back was quieter, lonelier somehow, without the gentle voice behind him, or the small familiar weight of someone trusting him to keep pedaling. The wind had picked up by then, whistling through the bare trees, and carrying with it the first sense of deep winter. Wood smoke, cold metal, and something bitter that always seemed to hang in the air after 9 o'clock. Andrei coasted the last block to his boarding house, a narrow 2-story with peeling paint and a porch light that never worked. He parked his bike quietly, climbed the steps, and reached into his pocket for the key, only to find an empty space. At first, he thought he'd simply reached into the wrong one. But after checking every corner, every pocket, every seam in his jacket and jeans, it became painfully clear. The key was gone. He knocked gently on the door, hoping the landlord might still be awake, but no lights came on. He knocked again, then louder. Nothing. When he tried the door knob, it didn't budge. Then, as if to confirm the inevitable, he glanced down and saw the small bundle of his belongings, his spare shirt, a towel, a cracked phone charger stuffed into a plastic grocery bag and left beside the door like yesterday's mail. There was a note taped to the door. 3 words written in thick black marker. Past du Lacs. His breath caught in his throat. He stood there for a long minute, bike at his side, unsure whether to curse or cry. He did neither. Instead, Andre turned back toward the center of town. His legs ached from the ride to Oak Hill and back, but he didn't let them rest. He pedaled slowly, knowing there was nowhere left to go, but needing to move anyway, because the cold was setting into his chest now, and stillness would only make it worse. It was nearly midnight when he passed the back alley of Johnson's Market, a small corner store, where he sometimes helped restock shelves in exchange for day-old bread and a few dollars here and there. The owner, Mr. Johnson, was kind in the way. Older men often were to kids they saw struggle without asking for help. Gruff, but never cruel. Andre parked his bike behind the dumpster, knocked once on the side door, and waited. A light flickered on inside. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and there stood Mr. Johnson, wearing a heavy robe and holding a steaming mug of something strong. He took one look at Andre, shivering and hollow-eyed, and sighed through his nose. Didn't make rent, huh? Andre shook his head. Mr. Johnson looked up at the sky like he was waiting for some higher authority to intervene, then stepped aside. Well, the storeroom's dry and there's a cot in the corner. Don't touch the wine crates and don't freeze to death on me. Andre nodded, murmured, "Thank you," and stepped inside. The storeroom smelled of cardboard and citrus, and the only heat came from an old radiator that groaned like it had a grudge. Andre didn't mind. He pulled the cot's blanket around his shoulders and let himself collapse onto the thin mattress, limbs heavy, chest sore, but heart strangely quiet. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid to close his eyes. Something about the ride, about Evelyn's hand on his shoulder and her laughter in the dark, had made the world feel a little less jagged. He drifted to sleep, thinking not of the locked door behind him, but of the silver pendant, the soft hum of wheels turning on gravel, and a voice that had said, "You remind me of someone I love." Outside, the wind howled against the store's walls, but inside Andre slept soundly, unaware that miles away, a woman sat at her kitchen window, now fully awake. In her lap was the same coat she had worn that night, and in her hand was a torn receipt with a phone number scrolled in uneven blue ink. Evelyn rose, no longer lost in fog, stared at the paper, and whispered his name like a prayer, the first warm thing she'd spoken into the quiet house in years. The morning arrived with a hush, pale and hesitant, as if the sky itself was unsure whether to wake. A soft gray light crept across the back room of Johnson's Market, filtering through the small dust-frosted window and settling over the quiet form of Andre, still curled beneath the thin blanket. The cold clung to the walls, slipped through the cracks in the old frame, and wrapped itself around his bones. But he didn't stir. Not yet. His body acted in the particular way that follows a long night on a hard cot, but deeper still was the heaviness that lived in his chest, the kind that came not from physical strain, but from too many days balancing survival on a threadbare wire. When he did finally rise, it was without complaint. He folded the blanket with care, tucked it against the wall, and moved quietly toward the front of the store, the rubber soles of his shoes silent on the linoleum floor. Mr. Johnson was already there as always, opening up with the stoic routine of a man who had long ago learned that consistency was its own kind of faith. He grunted when he saw Andre, then pushed a banana and a half-warmed cup of coffee toward him. No words, just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that meant more than conversation. Andre took the banana with a quiet thanks, peeled it slowly, and stood by the window, watching as the town exhaled into motion. Steam rose from the hoods of parked cars. Children shuffled along sidewalks, clutching their backpacks. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then was silent. It was just another day, another morning that looked like all the ones before it until the black car pulled up. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on these streets, too polished, too quiet, gliding into the curb like it was answering a summons. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, his coat too fine for a town like this, his shoes unscuffed, his posture deliberate. He glanced at a slip of paper in his hand, then looked directly through the store window, his eyes landing on Andre like he had always known where to find him. When the bell over the door chimed, and the man stepped in, the room seemed to shrink around him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, but with a weight beneath it. "I'm looking for someone named Andre." Andre turned from the window, frozen for just a breath. "That's me," he said cautiously. The man's expression softened with relief. "Miss Evelyn Rose sent me," he said. "She asked me to find you. She remembers everything, and she wants to thank you. She insisted." Mr. Johnson paused mid-sip of his coffee, but said nothing. Andre looked at the man, then down at the receipt in his hand, his own handwriting, the number he'd scrolled before riding off into the dark. It hadn't been meant for anything more than a lifeline. He never expected it to be used. Charles, as he introduced himself, held the door open, gesturing to the car. "She's waiting if you're willing." Andre hesitated, something flickering behind his eyes. The idea of going back to that house, of stepping into a world that didn't belong to him, felt like standing barefoot at the edge of a polished ballroom floor. He was just a delivery boy with no place to sleep, no family, no finish line. He had done what was right. That was all. "I just wanted to make sure she got home safe," he said quietly but firmly. "That's all it was." Charles regarded him for a moment, neither offended nor insistent. "And you did," he replied. "But she believes you gave her more than directions. She said you gave her back a sense of herself. She'd very much like to tell you that in person." Andre looked toward Mr. Johnson, who shrugged with the same indifference he used to mask concern. "Go," he said. "Your sea will be here if you need it." With a breath that felt too large for his chest, Andre nodded and followed Charles out. The drive to Oak Hill was surreal in daylight. The trees that had loomed like shadows the night before now stood tall and still, sentinels of some secret forest path. The turns felt shorter, the hills less steep. But Andre still remembered every one of them, each stone and slope etched into the memory of his legs. When they reached the grand white house, it no longer looked like a monument, but a memory, familiar, softened by the hour. Charles led him through the side entrance into a room filled with sun and old books and quiet warmth. There, seated by the window, was Evelyn, not the dazed wandering woman from the night before, but someone entirely different. Her eyes were sharp, her hair neatly pinned. And when she saw Andre, her smile broke over her face like morning over mountains. "You," she breathed, her voice trembling just enough to show its truth. "You brought me home." She reached for his hands, her grip gentle but insistent. "I remember everything, every street, every word. You didn't treat me like a stranger. You made me feel safe." Andre bowed his head, unsure what to say, the praise feeling too large for the simple act he had performed. But Evelyn wasn't done. She leaned forward, her eyes searching his. "I don't know your story," she said, "but I'd like to, and if you don't have a place to go, I would be honored to offer you one here. Not just for tonight, for longer if you'd let me. This house has too many rooms and not enough kindness. You would change that?" Andre blinked, the offer catching him completely off guard. It was generous, more than generous, and yet something in him resisted. He took a step back, his voice low, but steady. "That's kind of you, really. But I didn't do this to get anything. I just wanted you to be safe, that's all." Evelyn's eyes didn't waver. "And that," she said softly, "is exactly why I want you to stay." He didn't answer right away. The silence between them stretched, gentle but uncertain, filled with a feeling that neither of them could quite name. And though Andre would return to the market that night, would sleep again in the storeroom and wake to the same cold, something had shifted. He had been seen, not for what he lacked, but for what he carried. The quiet, steady light of someone who showed up even when no one was watching. And far from that sunlit room, Evelyn sat with a heart less alone, already preparing for tomorrow, when she would offer again, not out of charity, but out of recognition, because sometimes family is Not who we are born to, but who we choose to walk home with in the dark. The next morning came with a gentler sky, brushed with faint streaks of pale gold that peeked shyly through the faded curtain of cloud, as if the sun itself were hesitant to intrude on the stillness of the day. Inside the back room of Johnson's Market, Andre had risen early, as always, sweeping the floor and organizing crates in neat, quiet stacks, his mind too full of Evelyn's visit the day before to focus on the rhythm of work. He had replayed her words through the night again and again, each syllable lingering like the last note of a hymn that refused to fade. Her presence had not overwhelmed the room. It had warmed it. And yet Andre had not known what to do with such a gift. He never had anything offered so freely, so tenderly, and certainly not from someone who looked at him without judgment, only with hope. As he set down a box of canned peaches, the doorbell jingled, not in the usual impatient clatter of a regular customer, but in a soft, measured chime that felt familiar. He looked up from behind the counter, and there she was again, Evelyn Rose, this time with no driver, no coat of grandeur, just a wool shawl wrapped neatly over her shoulders and a small leather handbag tucked into the crook of her arm. Her expression was kind, her eyes already searching the room for him like she knew exactly where he would be. Andre straightened instinctively, his hands wiping unconsciously on his jeans as he stepped forward. She smiled and walked toward him, not with the authority of someone used to commanding space, but with the gentleness of someone who had decided to share it. "I hope you don't mind me coming again," she said softly, her voice warmer than the morning light. "I've been thinking about you all night." She paused, then added, "I suppose that sounds strange, but I mean it kindly." Andre nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. She looked around the store, then leaned a little closer, as though what she was about to say belonged only to the air between them. "I've lived in that big house for a very long time," she began, "and it has never felt so quiet as it did this morning. Not even after my husband passed. Not even after my grandson." She trailed off, then drew a breath. "You remind me of him, you know, his kindness, his eyes, the way he always listened more than he spoke. And when you helped me that night without asking, without expecting, something in me woke up. Something that had been sleeping for years." And Az looked down, the tips of his fingers curling slightly against the edge of the counter. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handwritten, slightly trembling lines of ink on thick stationery. "This is not a contract," she said. "It's not a deal or an arrangement. It's simply an invitation. I have a home with too many rooms and too few reasons to keep them closed. I'd like you to stay just until you find your footing. No strings, only support." Andre opened the note slowly. It was an offer to stay at the estate, a modest monthly stipend, and written beneath that in softer script, a promise. "We'll find a way for you to return to school if you still want that." He didn't speak for a long time. The world outside the window moved as if through syrup. Cars passed slowly. Leaves turned in the breeze, and the town went about its day, unaware that inside this little store something important was quietly shifting. Finally, Andre looked up and met her eyes, not with fear, but with something steadier. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like to come." And so he did. That afternoon, Charles came by with the car, not out of ceremony, but because Evelyn insisted Andre not ride that creaking bicycle up the long hill again. He packed his few belongings in a backpack, said goodbye to Mr. Johnson, who only nodded and handed him a paper bag of sandwiches and a muttered, "About time!" and then climbed into the back seat of a vehicle that smelled faintly of pine and possibility. Life at the estate was not extravagant. It was peaceful. Andre was given a sunlit room that overlooked the garden, a schedule that allowed him to rest, read, and within the month return to school with the help of a scholarship fund Evelyn created quietly in his name. She never paraded his story, never treated him like a pet project. Instead, she welcomed him into the rhythm of her days, morning walks in the greenhouse, long discussions over tea, and weekends filled with ideas about what they could do with the time and resources they now shared. Together, they created something Evelyn had dreamed of, but never built alone. A small foundation funded from her estate called the Willow Light Fund in honor of the street she couldn't remember and the kindness she would never forget. Its mission was simple: to support young people with potential but no path, to shelter the elderly who had slipped through the cracks, and to remind anyone listening that dignity and care were not luxuries. They were birthrights. Andre helped design the first programs, met with counselors, worked part-time at the community center the foundation renovated, and every so often still rode his old bicycle into town. Not because he had to, but because it reminded him of where he had begun, and what one small act of grace could grow into when offered without expectation. And each time he passed the old bus stop where it all began, he would slow down just a little, tip his head toward the sky, and smile. Because sometimes you don't find home, it finds you. And sometimes all it takes to change the course of a life is the willingness to stop, to see someone clearly, and to ride a little farther than you planned. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.